Yeah, I'd like to welcome everyone that's attending from all over the world. I see we've got members from the USA, from the UK, Canada, and South Africa. Welcome. We're going to have a great evening. I'm Lynette Rudman. I'm coming to you live from Grahamstown, South Africa. And this webinar will be recorded and it will be on our Learn the Birds YouTube channel in a few days' time. So if you want to watch this again, it'll be great. Or if somebody has missed it that you know of, tell them that it will be on the Learn the Birds YouTube channel. Please post any questions that you would like to ask Melissa at the end of her talk and in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. We'll have a question and answer session then. We're very excited to have a very special guest tonight, Dr. Melissa Whitecross. Melissa is BirdLife South Africa's Landscape Conservation Project Manager. She's responsible for coordinating the conservation of threatened and endemic terrestrial sites, as well as threatened species that live in those habitats. Melissa and her team work tirelessly to conserve the important grasslands of Southern Africa, which are the habitat to this very special bird called the Secretarybird. Now, for those members that don't know what a Secretarybird is, it is a large, long-legged ground eagle. It's a very special bird, and it's normally a bird that most overseas birders want to see when they come to bird in Southern Africa. Melissa will share with us the lessons she has learned in the 11-year conservation journey to save these very special birds, which Melissa calls the Sentinels of the grassland. And this is quite funny tonight. Melissa is normally the host of the BirdLife South Africa Conservation Conversations weekly webinar series. And tonight she's no longer the host for us, but she is the presenter. And she's a very good speaker. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about this very special Secretarybird. Over to you, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Lynette. Yeah, it is always a novelty to be on this side of the fence and not doing the quick intro. But thank you very much for the kind words. And I really hope that everybody enjoys tonight's webinar. I realized that I'm going to be speaking to an audience, many of whom are not from Africa. And I've really tried to delve down into the life history of the Secretarybird, which steps away from the science that we've been doing. But I've also thrown in some of the amazing research that we've been doing on this bird as a team for the last 10 years. I've been involved in the project for the last 6.5. And it's always been a species that has been very close to my heart. And I'll tell you why in just a moment. But it would be remiss of me to begin this talk without a few acknowledgements. My Secretarybird project would not have been in existence without the foresight of two very special humans, Ernst Retief and Dr. Hanleen Smith-Robinson, who kicked this project off back in 2011. And we've had several funders who have helped keep the show on the road. And we certainly are grateful to them for that support. And I've also had some really good support from our new Raptor project manager, who took over the Secretarybird main project management from me when I took the landscape conservation program, and that is Dr. Christian Brink. So a massive thank you to all of them. And without further ado, let's dive in and learn about the incredible Secretarybird. Now, as I said, this was a species that has always been very close to my heart and a very important part of my family. That is my late grandfather, William, who was the reason my birding interest was sparked. And I remember fondly that day in August '94, seeing my very first Secretarybird striding along the plains of Mopani in Kruger National Park, what a special sighting, and one that would change my life. That painting up in the left-hand side corner of the screen was a picture that sat in my opa's study for years. And I remember fondly watching it and always wishing that I was back in Kruger watching these incredible birds, and how lucky I was to end up having a career where I could ultimately help conserve them and learn a little bit more about them. So very blessed to have been able to follow that passion. But let's start off on the most important point. I would like to see the other contenders in the room for the world's most charismatic bird. I can say without worry of a doubt, the secretary bird will be on that contenders list. I mean, these really are the cover models of the birding world, having donned the covers of several magazines, being the face of the National Geographic Year of the Bird back in 2018. And just look at these guys. I mean, beautiful eye makeup, a huge crest of feathers on their heads, and those long, beautiful legs. They really are supermodels. And they've been the inspiration for several different logos and brands over the years, even having a wine named after them, which I am yet to get to taste, but hopefully one day I will get my hands on a bottle of Secretarybird Sauvignon Blanc. They also have donned two of the world's national emblems. Now, those of you who are geography buffs might recognize the one on the left as the national emblem of South Africa, the country which I call home. And it is not, in fact, our national bird, the blue crane, which sits on top of our national emblem. It is indeed the secretary bird, and the only other country in the world to share a national emblem secretary bird is that of Sudan. So two African countries making use of this iconic raptor on their national emblems. And they've also been carved out in the history books of Egypt. If you look closely, you'll see on that top arrow, the head of a secretary bird looking off to the right-hand side of the screen, and a tail down on the bottom left, and its long legs. This was one of the first discoveries of hieroglyphs of a secretary bird in the world. And Philip excitedly sent me these photographs a couple of years back, saying we are finally showing that secretary birds were traded during the times of ancient Egypt, and they suspect they were being traded out of the land of Punt, which to this day nobody has been able to locate. And this clue of the secretary bird may be a huge unlocking answer as to where that land lay back in those ancient times. So a fascinating bird, one which has captivated many an artist over the years, and one which has donned the incredible title of Bird of the Year for BirdLife South Africa back in 2019. Now, those of you who do not know BirdLife South Africa, we are a conservation NGO here in South Africa, the country partner to the BirdLife International Partnership, and we nominate a species every year to be our Bird of the Year. And with that comes the amazing honor of having pin badges. I wear mine proudly whenever I give this talk. We have fluffies, we get posters made, and a whole lot of incredible educational material. So if after tonight you are feeling inspired and you'd like to learn even more, you can hop on to our BirdLife South Africa website, and all of that educational material is available to download for free. And we'd encourage you with grandchildren and those of you in the education space, go and make use of those incredible Bird of the Year resources. It really is unbelievable what gets turned out every single year. But let's talk a little bit more about this bird's life history strategy. Now, in the wild, it's estimated that they live between 10 to 15 years. Now, I must stress, this is very much an estimate. It's very difficult to track these birds over the long term. It's near impossible to catch adults, and ring recoveries of birds that were rung as chicks are very few and far between. So at best guesstimate, 10 to 25 years. They weigh in at 3.5 to 4 kilograms. And the oldest known bird that we know of was a bird in captivity called Madeline, who was at the Hawk Conservancy Trust in the United Kingdom. And if any of you on the call have had the privilege of watching some of these flight displays and kicking displays that these Raptor rehabilitation centers do around the world, you will have caught a glimpse of some of the unbelievable talent of these incredible birds in action. But Madeline lived all the way to 34 years, breaking the ceiling on our known age of secretary birds. So when the conditions are right, these birds can live for a very long time. They are the world's tallest raptor, standing at a height of 1.5 meters, and they have a massive wingspan. We generally associate them as being the ground eagle, stomping their way across the savannas and the grasslands of Africa, but they do occasionally fly, and they can certainly fly quite far. When you behold one cruising through the air, you can see those broad wings, the black band to the back of those wings, and that diamond-shaped tail with the very long streamers that are identifiable off the back of these beautiful birds. And when you see them soaring overhead, particularly when they're in pairs, they are extremely elegant. Now, those of you from the States will hopefully have heard of the Cornell Wall of Birds project. This is an unbelievable mural housed at the Cornell University, where we know the unbelievable School of Ornithology has its home. What they did was to get this very talented artist to illustrate a planet of birds, 243 different families, 375 million years. You can see the dinosaurs coming off from the left-hand side here, evolving up into what is the modern day world of birds. And what is so incredible about this mural, they picked 270 unique bird species from around the world. And without a doubt, one of the most unique in Africa has got to be the Secretarybird. These birds are what we call a monotypic family. There is no other bird on Earth that belongs to the same genus as the Secretarybird. They are the only living member of the Secretaridae, which is the family for the Secretarybird. Now, don't worry if you don't know a thing about genetics. I'm not far behind you. All you need to know when you're looking at this tree created by Prum et al. Is that the closer you are on the branches, the more closely related you are. So you'll see the likes of Buteo and Accipiter, very, very close together there, but not so close to the likes of Cathartes and various others. Now, our Secretarybirds sit proudly within the accipitary forms, which is our very broad raptor group of families. So without a doubt, there was some dubious questions asked a few years ago as to whether Secretarybirds were just carnivorous storks or whether they truly were raptors that had adapted to walk. And that was settled with the genetics coming out. Secretarybirds are definitely raptors. And interestingly enough, their closest living relative is the osprey, a fish-eating specialist, and very interesting to see that the osprey is very near in terms of the genetic tree to our beautiful Secretarybirds. If there are any viewers watching from South America, you will know about the beautiful Suremas, very similar in appearance to our Secretarybirds, but far removed when it comes to their genetics, falling within a whole different group and order. So we certainly know that this is a case of convergent evolution, where two species have filled very similar niches and similar looks, but they are not that closely related. So that is where our Secretarybird sits in terms of the bird family tree. When it comes to distribution, this bird is found nowhere else on Earth except sub-Saharan Africa, and it likes to eke out its living in the open grasslands and savannas. You'll see very clearly in the middle here, the forests of the Congo do not hold our Secretarybirds, and the Saharan desert is far too arid for these insect and reptile-eating creatures to survive successfully. So that big yellow blob is where we find our Secretarybirds, but it's a little more nuanced than that, unfortunately. When we have a look at the current eBird data, and those of you who contribute to citizen science projects like this, I can only say a massive thank you to you, because without your efforts, we would not understand what is going on in the broad world. So if you are a citizen scientist and you are freely contributing your data to these projects, thank you, and please continue to do that. So all of these purple dots you see on screen are records of Secretarybirds being observed across the continent of Africa. Now, if you remember that big yellow blob, I'll go back there for a second. Just keep in mind where that big yellow blob is and have a look at how reduced our purple dots are. Now, yes, there's not as much birding activity taking place in some of Central and Western Africa, but nevertheless, when we start to look at the reporting rates across these different regions, we see quite a scary picture. Now, these numbers should shock you. They certainly shocked me when I started collating all of the different literature when we were undertaking a review of the status of the secretary bird. What you're seeing on screen is a mass loss of secretary birds across our continent. And there's various reasons as to why, and I'll go into those a little bit later. But the biggest threat to this incredibly wide-ranging open landscape needing species is that we are converting our open spaces into other land uses that do not support our beautiful secretary birds. And unfortunately, in West Africa, we've seen secretary birds go pretty much locally extinct in that part of the continent. Out in East Africa, our birds are largely confined to the likes of the Masai Mara and the Serengeti National Parks. And down in Southern Africa, we luckily do have birds outside of our national park network, but we have nevertheless observed major declines, 75% over the last 30 years. Very, very scary what is going on with our secretary birds. And this unfortunately led to the Global Conservation Status Review, which resulted in these birds being uplisted to endangered. Now you'll notice in 2011, they were globally uplisted to vulnerable, and in just the space of a decade, we have been able to demonstrate enough loss across the distribution of this bird and its known populations that it warrants a listing of endangered officially by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and BirdLife International, a hugely, hugely concerning result. But let's just dive a little bit more into the South African population, which is where I operate and where we are undertaking to try and understand what is going on. Now, for those of you who are not from South Africa, and those of you who are avid e-birders, here in South Africa, we have a slightly different citizen science project going on. We still do use eBird, but in competition with that is the Southern African Bird Atlas project. And this project's been going on for many, many years. It started back in 1987, and the first iteration of it concluded in 1991. Birders went out into pre-set up squares around the country, which we call quadrats, and they measured the presence of bird species over time. And we could then compare that with the second Southern African Bird Atlas project, which is fondly nicknamed SABAP2, which started up again in 2007 and has broken the country up into slightly smaller areas called pentads, which are simply 5 by 5 degree blocks, latitude and longitudinally. And these roughly 9 kilometer squared areas are sampled by our birders as frequently as possible around the country. And this data for us as BirdLife South Africa has been absolutely invaluable because it's allowed us to learn so much about what is going on with where our birds occur and what is happening to their populations on a large scale. So if you have a look at this map, what should jump out to you is that the birds in the red squares are sadly declining, and we're seeing fewer and fewer sightings of them in those historically strong squares. The birds in the blue squares, luckily, seem to be increasing in reporting rate. So that is a good thing to know. But as you'll see, unfortunately, far more red squares than blue squares. Now, we have some very clever people at BirdLife South Africa, Christian Brink and Alan Lee being two of them, and they've done some really clever modeling work to try and understand where our birds occur, how likely they are to occur in an area of South Africa, and what their likely abundance is. Now, you'll also see some of the interesting parameters coming out of this work. One of the biggest findings was that when we have a look at South Africa's population, it is very clear to us, based on the yellow areas you're seeing on that left-hand map, that these birds require large intact areas of grassland. So large, in fact, that we have put it down to approximately 1,000 hectares or more, if possible, of intact grassland to really secure their presence in a landscape. And they, as you can see on that left-hand bottom graph, it's very much about grassland. So these are just different indices that we can play with. I won't go into the technicalities of that, but the key thing here is that where we're getting a spike in our secretary birds, it is all about those open landscapes. The minute we get too much woody cover in, the birds disappear. If we have a look at this map on the right-hand side, this is telling us rough abundance estimates based on the reporting rates that we are getting from secretary birds. And unfortunately, what will jump out very clearly to you at the moment is that the central grasslands of South Africa moving into the Nama Karoo are probably our last stronghold for the species in the country. We have some evidence that the Kalahari region is still holding good numbers, but you'll see down in the Kruger National Park region, very faint numbers, which was previously quite a stronghold for this bird. And it certainly is concerning to see the way this distribution has shrunk. So I mentioned Ernst and Hanleen at the top of my talk. Just once again, a massive thank you to them for having the vision to kick off the Secretarybird project back in 2011 when these birds were uplisted. And BirdLife decided that we needed to address the problem of lack of data and lack of understanding of these beautiful, iconic birds. They're well known and widespread, but when it comes to their basic biology, we lack a lot of the simple information that many ornithologists and conservationists take for granted on many of our well-known birds. So BirdLife really does strive to do a lot of things using good science, and we certainly did our best to create a scientifically rigorous study on these incredible birds. And you'll see a lot of the data I'm going to present this evening is linked to these little tracking devices. We fit them, they are solar panel charged, and they run off of the cell phone network, the GSM network. We use these tracking devices to give us GPS fixes on the presence of these birds. And we've been tracking juveniles off of their nests over the last decade or so, and we've learned a lot. But the overall aim of this project really was to try and underpin the science needed to make priority conservation decisions that ultimately benefit the survival of our secretarybirds, but not just the secretarybirds. These are incredible flagship species for our grassland biome and our open savannas. We've been using this bird to tout the message that Africa needs its open spaces, and they need to be managed in a way that is effective, not just for the secretarybird, but all of the little LBJs and endemic larks and various other birds that utilize this system and are often forgotten. So BirdLife started, as I said, back in 2011 with 10 birds. These are our lucky 10, girls in pink, boys in blue, and unknown birds in yellow. We also tried tracking 2 rehab birds, but we decided that just from a project rigor point of view, we were going to stick with wild birds. And for the last 4 years, we have been deploying our second round of tracking devices, and you'll see all the birds on screen there, mostly males, interestingly enough. But we are very grateful to all of the many landowners who have allowed us onto their properties to track these birds and learn from them. These really are the birds flying the flag for their species and teaching us so much. And we're very grateful to Letitia Steinberg, who has offered us a further 10 devices, which we'll be using to understand the impacts of climate change on this incredible raptor, but more about that a bit later in the talk. So let's get back a little bit to what these birds are all about. I think without a doubt, they have got to be famous for their ability to kick snakes. Now watch the eyes of this bird when it is delivering a pinpoint accurate blow to the head of that snake. This was some incredible work done by Portugal et al., and they were trying to understand the amount of force and accuracy a secretarybird can kill its prey with. And unbelievably, these 4-kilogram birds can deliver a blow that is up to 5 times their own body weight in force. And they can do it absolutely accurately, irrespective of whether that snake is stationary or moving. They are phenomenal predators and very well designed to do what they do, using those legs to deliver very, very strong kicks. Now, this was an amazing case that I was asked to comment on, published in African BirdLife. Scott Chalmers photographed 3 birds that had come across a jackal. Now, you'll see by the plumage on these birds, the sort of rough speckling on their chests, these are likely quite young birds. And what is quite interesting in their behavior is that they have come across a sleeping jackal and decided to see whether they could test their abilities to either kill it or chase it off. It's still unclear which of the 2 they were having a go. But when you have a look at where that bird strikes the jackal right in the temple on the head, that jackal gets out of there very quickly. An unbelievable interaction. Watching these birds, they are not scared to take on large prey. And we've certainly seen them eat a range of different species. They are very much generalists, everything from scrub hares to thick-knees, locusts to lizards, and of course, the thing they are most famous for, to eat snakes. They are even capable of eating the eggs of nesting ground birds and regurgitating those back up onto the nest, as you can see in this photograph over here, where one of our camera traps caught these birds breeding and bringing eggs back to the nest for their chicks. Now, as I said, they are very well known for their ability to eat snakes, but in reality, they are actually hugely insectivorous, relying 87% of their diet on grasshoppers and locusts, which are luckily rather abundant in the grasslands of Africa if we haven't sprayed them full of pesticides, but we'll touch on that a bit later. Lizards make up around 3% of their diet, mice about 4%, and of course, snakes largely only making up around 1% of their diet. So these birds really are giant insectivores, and they are insanely effective hunters, as I mentioned. If you haven't seen one out in the wild doing what they do best, they're very visual predators. You can see they're spotting that grasshopper and delivering a fatal blow before a quick chomp and a swallow. You can see that nictitating membrane closing just to keep those eyes safe. They have very heavy scales on their legs, which allow them to avoid being struck by venomous snakes and various other prey items. And they're also very good at catching very nimble prey in bushes, which they will just continually stamp on. Now, because they're such visual predators and they are designed to walk, Kemp found that these birds were walking between 20 to 30 kilometers a day. They are not shy of a brisk walk. And if you try and follow one in the veld, you will struggle to keep up with them on a daily basis. They are extremely efficient movers and they can cover distance very quickly. This was a bird called Taimane. We tracked him from his nest in Warden in the Free State. He traveled all the way down to just south of Scottsboro on his first dispersal flight and spent a lot of time foraging around the eastern part of South Africa before setting up his very own nest at the tender age of just 2 years and 9 months. Now, this was the first record that we'd ever collected for age of first breeding in a secretary bird. And we had absolutely no idea that these very large birds were capable of breeding so quickly. Those of you who know anything about large birds like the southern ground hornbill or various other large raptors will know these big birds often take quite a while before they're able to breed. Something like an albatross takes a minimum of 7 years before it becomes sexually mature. Southern ground hornbills can take up to 9 years before they are capable of breeding. We find that male secretary birds within their 3rd year are capable of finding an older female, and they generally will breed. Females take about 4 years before they are able to reproduce, but they get going and build beautiful stick structures. And once they've found that mate, they are very dedicated mates. You'll often observe 2 birds working a field together. They form that very strong pair bond, and they will remain with that mate, provided that that mate remains alive. If one of the birds is sadly killed, they will then move on and find a new mate. But generally, if both birds are still alive, they will stick together and hold a territory together for as long as that territory is workable and has suitable prey. Once that pair bond is formed and they have decided to start a family, they will then seek out a very large tree, or not that large, respectfully, about 4 meters generally. They often pick these acacia thorn trees. You can see the one in the bottom screen here. Very, very difficult trees for predators to get into. And they will fill it with a very flat, large stick structure, which you can see on the top here, often stamping it down to really make that flat cup nest in the top of the tree. And this is where they will remain out in the open, raising their chicks. And even in the case of the fynbos biome, where there's a lot of agriculture, these birds are still capable of breeding. You can see the huge wheat field spanning out behind this nest from the Western Cape. But this just gives you a really nice idea of the flat-topped nests that these birds are capable of forming. And you can see 3 beautiful chicks there. Our secretary birds are capable of laying up to 3 eggs, and they will successfully raise every single one of those chicks if it is a good year and there is enough prey around for them to provision each of those chicks. They do not demonstrate canism or siblicide. These birds are very, very good at being social when they need to. And once that nest is established, these birds will incubate for approximately 42 to 45 days. You can see those 3 chalky white eggs. They don't always lay 3 eggs. They can lay just 1 or 2, but at an absolute maximum, 3 eggs are laid. They are nestlings for 10 to 14 weeks. They look a bit alien-like in the first 4 weeks or so, but by the time they reach 6 weeks, they really are starting to resemble the beautiful mini versions of the secretary bird. And at 8 weeks, they start getting a bit of character. And this is when we generally put our tracking devices on. Their bone structure is large enough, and they're busy filling out and fleshing out those bones. So by 10 weeks, they are ready to fledge, and they will then hang around the nest for roughly 6 months before dispersing off into their new life. The parents hang around and support them, obviously weaning them off into those next 6 months, but very, very attentive parents, both adults playing a role, and what an incredible life cycle to watch unfold. Now, we've been very lucky in South Africa. We've had the likes of Davy de Swart and various others carrying out very extensive nesting surveys, understanding what happens at the breeding site when chicks are on the nest, how long do they survive? But it became very clear to us that once those birds disperse, what happens to them? How many of these birds are recruiting back into the population? How many are dying as juveniles? And what's going on with this life history stage? And that was really some of the first questions that Ernst and Hanlene wanted to answer when they started the Secretarybird project back in 2011. So these key questions they were trying to understand with regards to the life cycle of the South African secretary birds was to understand the breeding biology, where the nests were and the activities at those nests, what is happening to those juveniles when they fledge from the nest, and what is their survival rate once they are in the post-fledging dispersal period. And I was lucky enough to come on board in 2018, and we wrote up this fantastic paper. Those of you who enjoy reading scientific literature can look it up. It's published in Ostrich, and this really helped us to determine the dispersal dynamics of juvenile secretary birds in South Africa, and was one of the first studies trying to understand what happens to these birds. So what I'm going to do now is try and make some very interesting science understandable and accessible for all of you. Don't get afraid by the graphs on screen. I'm going to talk you through them. So the first thing we need to have a look at is this map on the left-hand side here. You'll see the white star just behind my pointer. That was the nest of a bird called Bling. Now, Bling was tagged in 2013. Those of you who know South Africa, this is the Gauteng province. That little red dot is the Sondela Nature Reserve in southern Limpopo, and that was where Bling's nest was. Now, if you've got a keen eye, you'll notice very quickly that this was an old agricultural field, and it backs on to the N1 National Highway, which is one of our major thoroughfares in the country. And the reason the birds were able to utilize this area, which is surrounded by savanna bushveld, was that all of the trees had largely been cleared out of this section of the old farmland, and that opened it up enough for these birds to establish and breed. Now, there's Bling with his tracking device fitted, and what we really wanted to start to understand was how Bling was using the space around his nest. So each of these little blue dots you can see in the screen here are a location point at a given time during Bling's post-fledging dispersal period. And you can see each one of these in relation to the nest is a straight line distance. And that is what we've measured on this graph on the right-hand side. So I'm going to show you two different visual representations of this. What you're seeing on the animated graph on the left is how Bling's space use each week expanded. So these are what we call kernel density estimates. They just give you a rough estimate of the overall space use that a bird has around its territory. And each week you can see Bling getting far and far more inquisitive and adventurous. Now on the graph on the right-hand side here, we've got time of day along the bottom axis, starting at 6 in the morning and going across to 8 o'clock at night. And then we've got that straight line distance that I mentioned, right here at the nest in the bottom. And the further up this line we go, the further our bird is getting from his nest on average. Now we've color-coded the different months, blue being the very first month. You can see Bling didn't really go anywhere, staying very, very close to that nest, not adventuring at all. The older he got, in the mid-morning, he would step off once the grass was nice and dry. These birds do not like getting their feet wet. And as he got older and older, he really started to explore his territory, getting further and further away from his nesting area, even occasionally sleeping away from his nesting tree at night. So fantastic to be able to unpack the way these birds utilize their territory. We also looked at how long the birds were spending time in their different habitats. Now, we were lucky, we had a nice range of birds across South Africa's biomes. A biome is simply an area that is characterized by the dominant vegetation within it. So grasslands would be areas completely covered in grassland, equivalent to the prairies of the United States or the steppes of Russia. And obviously our savanna systems, those of you who've seen The Lion King, grasses and trees in a nice mixture. The Southern Karoo is one of our unique biome areas and well worth a visit if you are into botany. And of course, the Nama Karoo wedged between that beautiful succulent Karoo and the grassland biome, also a beautifully unique system. Now, what we've got along the bottom here are days in the natal home range. So that is the home territory or the nesting territory of these birds, from 0 when we fitted the tracking device to the day that our birds finally left home and dispersed off into the world. Now, these are all of our birds going up on the left-hand side. And what's quite interesting here is that these birds were hanging out in their different nesting territories for roughly 143 days. But our grassland birds tended to stay in their territories a little bit longer than our more arid system birds. Now, all of the blue, orange, and yellow systems are on the western side of the country and particularly low in rainfall compared to the more mesic or wet grassland areas on the eastern side of the country. And what's really important to note here is that when these arid systems do receive rainfall, they explode into an incredible bounty of life. And those of you who signed on early may have heard Lynette and I chatting about the incredible insect life that's come back after a bit of rain down in the Eastern Cape, where there's been an extreme drought for the last 6 years. Add a little bit of water to these very water-stressed systems, and life bounces back in abundance. And that means that there's a lot of prey availability for these parents to feed their chicks. The chicks can grow a lot faster, and they're able to provision them much quicker than they do in the more constant mesic systems that are in our grasslands. But it's obviously great to do all this research. It's even better if we can use it to do good conservation work. So you've already gotten used to these kernel density estimates I showed you earlier, understanding the area that these birds are using. We can use various different techniques to try and quantify the amount of space that a bird needs. But the most important thing we can do is utilize these kinds of measures to start informing things like our development industry and trying to make sure that when developers like our wind farm industry come along and want to put up turbines, if we find a secretary bird nest where they are scoping, we can put in scientifically rigorous measures to try and prevent any damage happening to those birds. So BirdLife South Africa has just released the first guideline document for nesting secretary birds at wind farm development sites, and it's being taken up into all of our EIA practitioners' reports, which is great to see. Because unfortunately, these birds are curious and they do occasionally turn up at the wind farms. So the more protection we can give them from those very sharp turbines, the better. And we have sadly lost 1 or 2 secretary birds in the last couple of years to turbines. So we don't want to see that becoming the norm. But on to slightly more happier subjects. We carry on with the life cycle of these incredible birds. This is one of the birds that Davy de Swart put a ring on, and Davy has done a fantastic job of banding these birds or ringing them, depending on which side of the Atlantic you sit. But that little silver ID ring has a number unique to this bird. It gets entered into a global database, and if this bird is ever found again, we can then set up 2 different time points. You can see where that bird was first rung, and when that bird is recovered, we can see where it has ended up. So that's great. We can see some of these birds are capable of doing amazing trips, over 1,500 kilometers from the eastern side of South Africa right into the heart of Namibia. And that was done in a sheer 4 months. Unbelievable, the distances that these birds are capable of moving. Some not moving so far, but what has been so wonderful with the advent of technology is that we can now start filling in the dots between those 2 endpoints, and we can follow exactly where our birds end up and where they went, instead of just having a straight line distance between 2 points. Now, one of the things that we've been able to look at with our tracking data is to start trying to understand what happens to the birds once they've left their nest. Do they leave and never come back? Do they come back to the same territory? What are their movements like? Now, the behavior where an animal leaves its natal territory and ultimately returns to that site is called natal philopatry. It makes sense. You were successfully raised there as a juvenile secretary bird, and if you come back to that area, there's probably quite a high likelihood that you would also be able to establish a territory and successfully raise your own brood. So once again, we've got the number of days since we fitted tracking devices. So from 0, when we first put the devices on, going up, and then we've got the straight line distance over the period of time that we tracked those birds. So from the nest that we knew about to the maximum distance that that bird ever traveled away from its nest during its dispersal period. And we noticed 2 very important things. When these birds leave the nest, they're capable of going quite far. You can see a bird like Archer over there traveled over 800 kilometers. Sadly, we lost Archer over Lesotho and we're not sure what happened to him, but nevertheless, the rest of the birds did what we thought they would, which was to go a whole way away and then return. And what was very interesting for us to start noticing was that females would generally disperse from their nesting grounds, and when they came back, they would come back to within approximately 200 kilometers of their natal territory. Males, on the other hand, would go a lot further, but they would come back to within 40 or 50 kilometers of their natal territory. So much more philopatric than the females, and that probably has some genetic advantages to avoid any inbreeding, which is great. Now, sadly, dispersal is a very risky business. You can see that you've got to contend with a number of different threats in the landscape: fence lines, land conversion for agriculture, having to compete with your own kind, or even being taken on by the likes of tawny eagles trying to steal your recently killed snake. Now, I want to demonstrate how risky dispersal can be with Bling once again. This unbelievable bird, there is his nest in the southern Limpopo region. What you see here is an orange dispersal line, and over time, we traveled all the way up to the Machari Pans, spent a bit of time with some of the flamingos, decided that pink wasn't his color, and Bling then traveled all the way back down. But what is so incredible is that Bling traveled 467 kilometers in just 2 weeks after leaving his natal territory, an unbelievable distance to move for a relatively young bird. Now, what you see here is the north of Pretoria, and those of you who are familiar with the Pretoria region, this is a big metro area, lots of buildings, lots of people living there, very, very small grassland fragments remaining. And all of these little clusters are essentially islands of grassland that remain within this highly transformed northern Gauteng region. Bling sadly succumbed one morning on a power line. He was following a fault fire and flew into the cables and was fatally wounded, and certainly demonstrating once again how tricky these landscapes can be for these young, naive birds to navigate. Bling was just 2 years and 9 months, so he could have been on his way to establishing a territory if he weren't killed on that power line. And it is a bit of a somber thought. Of the roughly 20 odd birds that we have tracked, we have lost several of them within the first 3 years. This is unsurprising. We know that there is high juvenile mortality within our big raptors and large terrestrial birds. But what is very scary here is that only 2 of our birds, the ones with yellow around their X's, were killed by natural causes. Every single one of the other birds was linked to some kind of anthropogenic disturbance, be it power lines, fence lines, poisoning. We ran into a number of different threats with these unfortunate birds. But luckily, many of them have survived, and as I showed, have gone on to breed, which is hugely exciting. Now, South Africa has a well-established protected area network or national park network, and roughly 9% of our country, all these bits in dark green, is under some kind of formal conservation protection. That means there is legal backing to the conservation of that site. Now, if we have a look at our tracking data from the phase 1 of our project, you'll notice very quickly that the majority of our points were not falling within those national parks and protected areas. And this really stood out for us because it made us realize our secretary birds are not targeting our national parks, which are often not designed to capture the wide open landscapes that these birds require to survive. And that puts a lot of onus on us as a conservation authority to start having conversations with people like farmers and cattle grazers who are maintaining open landscapes within our country. And we need to be able to work with them if we're going to save these birds, because as you can see, only 3% of our tracking data was within some kind of formal conservation area. So it's a novel opportunity, but also a risky one, because it means these birds are moving through our human-dominated landscapes, and we need to make sure that we're managing them appropriately. Now, I always like using the slide. It is a bit of a sombering one as usual, but this is the Kruger National Park. For those of you who are not from South Africa, this is probably South Africa's main and most well-known conservation area on the eastern side of the country. It is 20,000 hectares of beautiful bushveld. It is a stunning part of the country, and it used to be home to roughly 250 pairs of secretary birds. Unfortunately, as you can see on screen there, our reporting rates of these birds using the Atlas data have declined severely, going from a roughly 20% reporting rate a mere 20 years ago, right down to 0.4%. And there's various reasons for that. But before we go into some of them, this is a trend that's being shown by many of our large birds. The ground hornbill, the Kori bustard, all showing declines as Kruger starts to shift in its habitat structure and becomes less suitable for these birds. Now, one of the main reasons that we know of our birds are doing so badly is that, as you've seen earlier, the way these birds disperse, they are exiting out of this national park into a highly transformed and threatening landscape. And we suspect many of our Kruger juveniles are sadly being killed before they have the opportunity to recruit back into the national park and continue the population of this incredible species. One of the other challenges is obviously linked to bush encroachment. Now, this was an incredible study done by Megan Lofty-Eaton. She was trying to understand the relationship of tree cover to the presence of secretary birds. Now, what you see on the bottom here, at 0, that would be a complete grassland, absolutely no trees in the landscape. The higher up this graph you go, that would be a forest at 100%. So anything in between 80 to 20 is our typical savannas. You can see that landscape in this picture over here. So a mix of trees and grasses. Now, unfortunately for secretary birds, what Megan found was that the minute woody encroachment starts to go above 20%, our secretary birds are disappearing from that landscape. It's a huge, huge challenge for these birds to be able to walk effectively, run and catch prey, and it provides the prey with a lot of escape routes, being able to shoot up trees and into bushes. So secretary birds really do need those open landscapes to hunt effectively. And with that, it's very clear across South Africa, the amount of woody encroachment that we've seen. And it's always scary to consider just how much of our open landscapes have been transformed by these encroaching woody species that are really taking advantage of the high levels of carbon that we've pumped into the atmosphere. Trees are extremely good at sequestering carbon, and they can grow very quickly. And as you can see in this photograph taken 55 years apart, just how much of South Africa has been transformed in a very rapid space. Certainly worrying to see images like that. We've also seen within our Atlas data, as I mentioned, an over 70% decline in secretary birds within Kruger Park. So hugely worrying for one of our big conservation jewels. But luckily we know that these birds are not completely dependent on the national parks to survive. Now, this is 2 of our newer birds. What you're seeing here is aerial photographs of Johannesburg, specifically the southwest of Johannesburg. There is the Johannesburg Metro over here. And anyone who knows the area, the Southwestern Township, or Soweto, a very famous area, particularly during the apartheid years, is just over here. And off to the left are some of our gold mines, specifically the Harmony gold mine in this case. Now, these big slimes dams that hold a lot of the waste coming off of our mining activities are often backed by little islands of grassland. And amazingly, we had 2 birds tracked on 2 completely different nests, finding their way into a field at exactly the same time earlier this year. Now, these 2 birds, there's the one in yellow, Nico, who was tracked from the west of Johannesburg, and another bird called Egoli, who was tracked down in Heidelberg. These two birds, by some miracle, found their way to this exact same field and spent 8 months there together, wandering around. Egoli has since moved off and is moving back towards his nest. But it's incredible when one flies, and I had the privilege of taking this photograph this morning, flying back into Johannesburg. You can just see what used to be one of the biggest grassland areas in the world has now been made famous because we've turned it into the biggest man-made forest. And that means birds like our secretary birds have lost out. Yes, it's an incredible feat. There's a lot of birds that have benefited from the planting of trees, and there are many reasons to plant trees, but we have taken an open landscape that was functioning beautifully and turned it into something that is completely unconducive for grassland requiring species. And just to show you the picture across South Africa, some of the work that we've been looking at is trying to understand foraging islands. And if you've ever been to the Western Cape, you'll know the Cape Peninsula over here. These are little island pockets of suitable habitats that these birds are seeking out and surviving in. What we've done here is remove all of the movement data between those pockets, but you can see exactly where they're stopping and spending time to forage just by looking at the clustering of these dots. And we can start to learn a lot about our landscape and the connectivity between these open landscapes by watching these birds. And we're really starting to unpack some exciting science. Now, South Africa releases a national biodiversity assessment every year. Sorry, not every year, every few years. The latest one came out in 2018. Sadly, with some very scary stats. What you see on screen there are the little white ants, which we like to call our anthropogenic ants. They have eaten away at these natural biomes and turned them into something that is not natural anymore, be it a human settlement, be it an agricultural establishment of monoculture, be it forestry. These little patches have been transformed out of natural habitat. And many of them have taken place in some of our most threatened ecosystems. You can see the colors there, red being the most critically endangered, orange being endangered, moving down towards vulnerable and least concern in green. Now, we have roughly 950,000 square kilometers of natural habitat remaining, but these are rapidly being eyed for things like wind development and various other developments. So we really do have our work cut out for us. We know already that by the year 2014, we had converted 60% of our grasslands into something else. Now, our grassland biome makes up 30% of South Africa's land mass, and we've turned 60% of that into something else. Very, very concerning. If we have a look at the kinds of habitats that our secretary birds are selecting for, we know that these are birds of the open grassland, and we have wonderful citizen science projects like the Coordinated Avifaunal Road Count, or CAR, and through the amazing volunteering of all these ornithologists and citizen scientists going out, we've been able to show that our secretary birds are very much using these natural areas of what we call veld in South Africa, prairie if you're in America, or steppe if you are in Russia. But these beautiful green open spaces are very much required by our birds. In the Western Cape, it's a slightly different picture. You'll notice in the Overberg and the Swartland, two of our big agricultural areas where much of what was renoster veld, the natural biome that would have occurred there, is now converted into wheat fields and various other grazing pastures. These birds have had to adapt because there's very little natural veld left, but luckily they have seemed to be able to do so. Now, what we're trying to do in unpacking some of this work is to look at the foraging islands of these birds. You can see all of these little red islands, as I mentioned earlier. Really fascinating to watch just how these birds can eke out a living. There's bling moving between two settlements along a wetland. They do not go into the man-made structures. So as I said, we're trying to quantify what's going on, and using our different biomes that I spoke about earlier, we're starting to learn a little bit about the size and the space that these birds require in our different biomes. And you can see on screen there, down in the Western Cape, the purple fynbos, we have a very interesting situation because these birds are so restricted by what is available. They are spending the longest amount of time in these foraging islands, but their foraging islands are some of the smaller foraging islands available, whereas our savanna and our grassland birds tend to spend roughly 12 days in their foraging islands, with a slightly larger home range and space use in the grassland biome, which is a much more open and expansive landscape, than our savannas, which often have trees and various other things confining the space in that landscape. We've also started to look at the pressures around these different foraging islands, and you'll see very quickly agriculture and forestry are surrounding roughly 60% of the areas that these birds are selecting to operate in. About 40% of their time is spent in very natural areas, and 1% seeking out water in man-made dams and different sections of canals to try and survive. They are very water-dependent species. Now, I've mentioned the challenges within the landscapes. These are some of them. Bad landscape management can result in bush encroachment, erosion, even exposure to pesticides. We know these birds are taking things like locusts and rodents, and we certainly understand that this is having a huge impact on them. We unfortunately don't have the science to back up that statement yet, but we're very fortunate to be able to recruit an ecotoxicologist going forward. And we're hoping that through the hiring of this individual, we'll be able to start collecting data to understand exactly what kind of exposure our birds are getting from ingesting pesticides and rodenticides. As I mentioned, collisions are a huge challenge. Over the last 20 years, we've seen over 100 birds die on power lines. Within our tracking study, 3 of our 20 birds went down on power lines. This is a major, major challenge for these birds. And one of the birds that I was working on, the very first one that I got to fit a tag on was Kwezi. She sadly made the headlines all for the wrong reasons, because on her very first dispersal flight, this was her nest over here, Kwezi disappeared off, traveled 26 kilometers, and unfortunately hit that power line you see over there and was fatally injured. So a massive loss for us, and losing a bird within the first 6 months of its life is just an absolute tragedy. So we are recruiting a master's student at the moment in Finland to have a look at the risks these structures pose to our birds, trying to understand where the high-risk landscapes are and where we really need to make more of an effort to mark these lines and try and prevent these birds from colliding with these cables. Apologies if you are a sensitive viewer, this is a bit of a graphic slide. This is a horrible way for a bird to die, and it unfortunately happens all too often. Badly managed fences with loose wires can trap these birds, as you see there, and they will die a terrible death, starving and hanging from that fence line. And if you know anything about the open landscapes of South Africa, we are riddled with millions and millions of kilometers of barbed wire fence. It poses a huge challenge to our birds. And what we're trying to do with our tracking data is to start understanding the way these structures can influence how our birds are moving in the landscape. And we've got some really exciting research underway to try and look into this very pertinent threat in the landscape. We're also starting some wildlife-friendly fence trials, and this is the Middelpunt wetland in Dullstroom in the eastern part of South Africa. We are looking to build a wildlife-friendly fence to protect one of our wetlands where a critically endangered bird currently lives. This is Dr. Carl Lloyd and Dr. Christian Brink, and Carl's put a lot of effort into understanding how to build what is essentially a wildlife-friendly structure, as wildlife-friendly as possible, given that we need to keep the cattle out of the wetland. And one of the most important things that you can do if you have fences on your property is to change that top strand from being barbed to having plain wire. As you can see, this poor grass owl has gotten snared on a barb, and unfortunately, that patagial membrane gets damaged, and these birds generally have to be euthanized when they are found. We're also putting in some great collaborations. We're trying to understand the impacts of climate change. This is Wesley Gush. He'll be starting a PhD with us next year, and he's going to be looking at the impacts of these increasing temperatures on our secretary birds. So some really, really exciting research coming out. But just in closing, I know I've really used up the hour. What are we doing to take all of this amazing research forward? And something I always like to stress with our conservation supporters is that we really don't like to just make decisions without thinking carefully and backing up our decisions with science. And it does take us a good few years to get good science under our belts, but we are starting to get to that point. And at this year's Pan-African Ornithological Congress taking place in Victoria Falls next month, we've managed to secure a round table with all of the African ornithologists and conservationists getting together to talk about the best way forward as a continent to try and save these birds and develop an effective species action plan that will enable us to monitor and protect our beautiful secretary birds at the continental scale. We're also very excited because we are at the moment recruiting a new Secretarybird Conservation Officer to BirdLife South Africa. This incumbent will be charged with putting in some dedicated hours into monitoring our secretary bird populations and furthering the incredible research that has been done so far. We are extremely excited to have this person starting up next year. Another major role they'll be playing is to engage with farmers and landowners and find out ways that we can make our landscape outside of our national park network safe for not just secretary birds, but all of our large terrestrial birds and raptors utilizing these open, privately owned landscapes. And one of the really big conservation successes we've had is using a mechanism called biodiversity stewardship, where we sign agreements with private landowners to secure their properties as privately protected areas across our grassland biome. The team has done a phenomenal job so far, being recognized in this year's African Conservation Awards for their efforts, growing South Africa's grassland conservation estate by close on 150 hectares thus far. Absolutely incredible effort. And by doing this, we establish long-term relationships with these landowners and can continue to manage these sites as safe spaces for our birds. Now, I just want to end with a call to action for all of you. And if you travel onto BirdLife South Africa's website, and you can see the link on the screen there, you will find the Secretary Bird page. There is a great video on that page, which you can click and watch. It will help you understand how we are monitoring these birds and how you as a citizen scientist can assist us to do this. And you are also able to report any secretary bird nests that you know of. We are rapidly building up a database. We've got close on over 80 records of nesting secretary birds from just the last 5 years. So we really are asking all of you to get involved. If you know of secretary bird nests, either historic or current, please do get in touch with us, and you can send in your data via that link on the website, and you can let us know exactly where these nests are, and we can continue to understand where our breeding population is so that we can focus our conservation efforts onto those sites. We've also got a button where you can report any fence entanglements. So please do let us know if you have encountered any of that in your travels. And lastly, if you'd like to stay up to date with what's going on in the project, we do have a Facebook page, and you can keep tabs on all that's happening with our Secretary Bird project there. So I know a lot of what I've said tonight has probably left you feeling very worried. Please do not feel worried. There are incredible conservationists out there working together to try and save these birds, and we can all play our part. Go out there and tell people about what you've learned tonight, encourage them to learn more about these incredible birds, encourage landowners that you know to get in touch with us so that we can help them improve their landscapes for these wonderful birds who share these beautiful open spaces with us. And if you would like to know more about the project, we've got several webinars out there. Lynette mentioned that I host a webinar series on a Tuesday night at 7 o'clock. We've got all of those webinars on YouTube. You can head over there and catch up with all the conservation conversations action. But finally, just to acknowledge, there are so many funders, donors, partners who have made this project possible so far. It would be absolutely impossible to thank all of them right now, but they all know who they are, and we are extremely grateful to them for the constant support that they have offered us over the years, and we look forward to continuing those important relationships. So that is me tonight. Apologies, I did go a bit over time, but I hope that you all enjoyed that, and I'm more than happy to take a few questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Melissa. That was absolutely brilliant. I enjoyed it so much.
Thank you, Lynette.
Yeah, can we start with the first question from David? He said,
Sure.
Do they occupy the same regions as the shoebill? I frequently see photos of shoebill in safari ads. I don't think I've seen a secretary bird.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Lynette, and it's maybe something, given the way these birds are disappearing, they are rapidly going to become a very sought after bird in Africa, I suspect. But to answer David's first part of his question, shoebills are swamp dwelling dinosaurs. They are extremely charismatic birds, very stork-like. They live in the very large wetlands that span out across Zambia, Uganda, and the central parts of Africa. Secretary birds do occur in the regions, but they will tend to be more on the dry grasslands on the edges of those very large wetland areas. So you may encounter one on a day's birding when you're going after the shoebill, but they certainly are not going to be in the swamps where the shoebills eke out their living.
And David also asked, do conservation efforts for mammal species conflict with habitat preservation for the secretary birds?
That's a good question, and I suppose it would depend on which mammal we're focusing on. I'm not sure if David's alluding to something like an elephant or others. Certainly, there are benefits to having areas dedicated to our mammals, in particular our big mammals, but there can be challenges as well. We know, for example, in Kruger, where we've seen a massive increase in the number of elephants, it is having an impact on the habitat. Nesting trees are being pushed over. Mapani, instead of being cleared, is sort of being felled to a very dense hedge layer, which is closing off a lot of these areas for our secretary birds. So pros and cons on that front, but certainly any effort to conserve species does not go amiss. We just got to make sure that we're not homogenizing all of our conservation efforts and really look at areas for what they need to be. And we do need our open spaces. We also need our savannas and our forests. So we've got to make space for all of them.
Yeah, for sure. I Like Birds asked, how do you sex secretary birds? Is it wing length, mass, plumage?
With great difficulty, and this debate rages on. So at the moment, we use genetic blood sampling to sex our secretary birds. It is near impossible to sex them in the field at the moment. We are working on a few theories, but at the moment, it is very, very difficult to sex these birds. There's two schools of thought as to whether the male or the female is the slightly larger of the two, but they're often very similar in size. And it is a real challenge to try and tell them apart.
Mm-hmm. And I Like Birds also said, we saw one on the top of a flat acacia tree. The next day there were two birds. This was July. Would they be nesting already?
Yeah, so what's amazing about the secretary birds, and that's great, you could very well have seen a nest site in that case. Please let us know where it was if you can remember. These birds are able to breed at any time of the year. They are by no means restricted like some of our other species. They do tend to follow rainfall patterns. Where we've had a particularly wet winter, you might find birds breeding a bit earlier. It's absolutely possible that they could be building nests through July. We've had birds with chicks on the nest in August often. So it's very much linked to seasonal rainfall and prey abundance. If the prey are abundant and there, these birds will often take advantage of that and breed.
Thanks, yeah. John was asking, do they build their nests in whistling thorn acacias? If so, do they get protection from the acacia's ants? I'm not sure what whistling thorn acacias are.
I suspect that's one of the Kenyan species, John, and you'll forgive me here. I should know where this is, but that is a very good question. I'm not actually sure. I suspect that the ants would offer some protection to them if they are using those trees, but I personally am not 100% sure if the ants would tolerate the birds coming in and building on that structure, and they wouldn't go for them. So something to look up. I'll have to go and do some homework on that. Thanks.
Yeah. I think also the thorns of the acacia, that we get here in Southern Africa would probably help, keep the predators away. Because some of them
Absolutely.
are very thorny.
Absolutely, yeah. And these birds really do seem to seek out those very structurally complex bushes and thorny structures.
Yeah.
It certainly does prevent the likes of honey badgers and various other things getting up into the nest.
Yeah, for sure.
Especially ornithologists trying to get to the chicks.
Someone else was asking, what are the close relatives of this bird in Africa?
So as I showed on that one slide, the closest relative is probably the osprey, but for many millions of years, the living relatives of the secretary bird are no longer with us. They have, for whatever reason, gone extinct, and the secretary bird is the last living member of the branch of the phylogenetic tree that is the Secretarybird. So we don't know of any other very close relatives other than the osprey.
Okay, and Elizabeth was asking, there are a lot of seemingly white names in your list of supporters and researchers. How much are Black communities in South Africa aware of the issues around conservation of secretary birds?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and thanks for that. We certainly recognize that is a challenge in South Africa, and as BirdLife, we are trying very hard to change that narrative and change the demographics of our supporters and the people we engage. Culturally, this bird is revered. Intungunono is its Zulu name. It's not one that's used often in medicine, but they are certainly admired for their ability to kill snakes, and certainly not a bird that is persecuted in any way. People are very tolerant of them culturally in Africa generally. We've seen 1 or 2 incidents where birds have been sort of poached to try and sell for the pet trade. Thankfully, that is not something that we're seeing too much of, and we hope that that doesn't continue. But they are a bird that is around, is noticed, and is well liked culturally. So from our perspective, we are doing our best to engage with rural communities in the landscapes that we do work, and we are growing our ability to develop education materials and improve awareness around better rangeland management. We've got a very exciting project happening in the southern KwaZulu-Natal region, where we're working with the Meet Naturally group to train herding for health candidates who are local community members that are cattle ranchers, and they work with our team to better manage their grazing on their pastures to prevent things like overgrazing and erosion and ensure that those grasslands stay healthy. And of course, where possible, let us know that they've got secretary birds, southern-billed ibis, and various other interesting birds coming into the system. And we've just set up a very exciting project with Conservation South Africa, working with some of their other herding for health candidates around the country to begin monitoring some of the birds using these landscapes.
Oh, that's great. I'm sure the blue swallow will fit in there as well.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Melissa, I think that's the end of the questions. Lots of praise for your talk in the comments below. Thanks so much for chatting to us. We really enjoyed every minute. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a great privilege. Thanks, everyone. And if anybody thinks of any last minute questions, feel free to drop me an email. Thanks all.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.